The story of the Bronze Age is a story of brilliance, of trade and invention, of kingdoms that flourished beside the sea. It is also the story of one of history's most mysterious disasters, the sudden arrival of the people we now call the Sea Peoples. Their presence is written in fragments across ruined temples, broken tablets, and fading inscriptions, but their true identity remains hidden in shadows. Tonight, as you listen, we will travel back more than 3,000 years, to the time before the collapse, and slowly walk through the silence of history, searching for clues. The Bronze Age, lasting roughly from 3000 to 1200 BCE in the eastern Mediterranean, was an age defined by metal and by connection. Bronze, made from copper and tin, allowed weapons to be stronger, tools to be sharper, and art to shine with a new brilliance. But bronze did not appear by magic. It demanded long trade routes, reaching from the tin mines of distant lands to the copper mines of Cyprus. Ships moved across the sea carrying metals, olive oil, wine, ceramics, and ideas. And so the world became tied together, stretched across waters and deserts, joined by caravans and fleets. In Egypt, mighty pharaohs built temples that still stand today. In Mesopotamia, scribes pressed symbols into clay tablets, leaving behind libraries of trade records, myths, and royal decrees. The Hittites ruled in Anatolia, a power strong enough to rival Egypt itself. On the islands of the Aegean, Mycenaean kings ruled from palaces filled with painted frescoes. To the west, mysterious cultures of Italy and beyond watched and waited, as bronze tools transformed their own societies. The entire region was alive with contact, diplomacy, and wealth. It was a connected system, a web of power, stretching from Greece to Canaan, from Troy to Thebes. And then, something happened. Around the year 1200 BCE, this network began to unravel. Cities burned. Palaces collapsed. Trade routes fell silent. One after another, kingdoms that had lasted for centuries crumbled. The Hittite Empire, once mighty, vanished from history. Mycenaean Greece fell into darkness. Even Egypt, though it survived, trembled under the weight of invasion. It was an age of endings, a collapse so profound that historians still debate its causes. Among the fragments of evidence, one name appears again and again: the Sea Peoples. Egyptian inscriptions speak of them with fear. Reliefs carved into the walls of temples show battles on land and sea, with strange warriors arriving in great numbers. They came in ships, entire families with oxen and carts, as if migrating rather than raiding. They were called invaders, foreigners, enemies, from the midst of the sea. But who they were, where they came from, and why they struck at the great powers of the Bronze Age, remain questions without final answers. The Sea Peoples have become a symbol of mystery in ancient history. Were they a coalition of displaced tribes, driven by famine or climate change? Were they pirates, seizing wealth as the great empires weakened? Were they refugees from distant wars, forced onto the sea in search of new homes? Or were they something even larger, a movement of entire peoples, shifting the balance of civilizations forever? As we begin our journey tonight, we will not rush to solve these questions. Instead, we will move slowly, like the ships of the ancient world drifting across the Mediterranean, listening to the echoes of history. We will explore the evidence left behind, the inscriptions, the ruins, the pottery, the myths. We will walk through the collapse step by step, allowing the silence of time to fill the gaps. The Sea Peoples appear most vividly in the records of Egypt. Pharaoh Ramses II, known as Ramses the Great, fought against them at the Battle of Kadesh, where he clashed not only with the Hittites but with mysterious allies who fought by their side. Later, during the reign of Ramses III, the Egyptians recorded great battles against waves of invaders from the sea. The reliefs at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu show ships locked in combat, warriors with feathered helmets, round shields, and swords of strange design. These images, carved more than 3,000 years ago, are some of the earliest depictions of naval warfare in human history. But before we reach those battles, we must understand the world that existed before the collapse. Imagine standing on the harbor of Ugarit, a great city on the Syrian coast. The air is filled with the smell of cedar wood and spices. Ships from Cyprus and Crete unload their cargo. Scribes record the transactions in cuneiform script. In the distance, farmers bring grain, while artisans hammer bronze in their workshops. Ugarit was wealthy, a city connected to all the powers of the Mediterranean. And yet, within a generation, it was gone, burned, destroyed, never rebuilt. Letters found in its ruins speak of panic, of enemies approaching, of pleas for help that never came in time. The same story repeats across the map. In Greece, the palaces of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos fell. Their storerooms of grain and oil, once symbols of power, were looted and abandoned. In Anatolia, the capital of the Hittite Empire, Hattusa, was left in ruins. In Canaan, cities were destroyed or replaced. Only Egypt, shielded by the Nile and its deserts, managed to resist, though at great cost. This was not a single event, not a single battle, but a wave of collapse spreading over decades. What could cause such destruction? Some scholars speak of earthquakes, a series of natural disasters shaking the eastern Mediterranean. Others point to climate change, a period of drought that starved entire regions, pushing populations into movement. Still others suggest internal rebellion, as peasants and workers rose up against kings and elites. But again and again, the inscriptions return to the same phrase, invaders from the sea. It is tempting to see the Sea Peoples as the cause of everything, sweeping across the region like a storm. But history is rarely so simple. Perhaps they were not the spark, but the flame that followed. Perhaps they were both migrants and raiders, both desperate refugees and warriors seeking opportunity. Perhaps the collapse of the Bronze Age was not one story, but many, converging at once. And so, in this series, we will move through 7 chapters. In each, we will look at a piece of the puzzle. The rise of the Bronze Age world. The network of trade that tied kingdoms together. The first signs of instability. The arrival of the Sea Peoples. The collapse of the empires. The survival of Egypt. And finally, the legacy of this mysterious age, which still shapes how we think about history today. As you listen, you may find yourself drifting, as if on a calm sea under the stars. The voices of the past are quiet, but they are steady. They remind us that civilizations, no matter how strong, are fragile. They remind us that history is full of mysteries, waiting patiently for us to return. This is the story of the Sea Peoples. This is the story of the Bronze Age collapse. And this is where our journey begins. The Bronze Age was not only an age of kings and palaces, but also an age of movement, of exchange, and of delicate balance. To understand the mystery of the sea peoples, we must first understand the world they entered, a world bound together by trade, diplomacy, and the endless rhythm of ships moving across the Mediterranean Sea. Bronze itself gave the age its name. This remarkable metal was stronger than copper, sharper than stone, and more durable than wood. But bronze could not exist without cooperation. It was made from two ingredients, copper and tin. Copper was abundant in some places, particularly on the island of Cyprus. Tin, however, was rare, found in distant lands that may have included the mountains of Anatolia, the deserts of Central Asia, and even the faraway rivers of Europe. To bring these metals together required travel, negotiation, and trust. It required ships to cross the sea, caravans to move across deserts, and rulers to maintain peace along the trade routes. From the very beginning, the Bronze Age was international. It was a world that depended on connection. Picture the Mediterranean not as a barrier, but as a great highway of water. Each spring and summer, when the winds were steady and the seas were calmer, ships set out from their harbors. Some carried cargoes of copper, stacked as heavy ingots shaped like ox hides. Others carried amphorae filled with olive oil, wine, or grain. Still others carried objects of beauty, glass beads that sparkled in the sun, ivory carved into combs and ornaments, or jars painted with intricate designs. Each harbor became a meeting place, where merchants spoke many tongues, where scribes wrote records in clay and papyrus, where the wealth of faraway lands was exchanged in busy markets. One of the most remarkable discoveries of modern archaeology is the Ulubaran shipwreck, found off the coast of modern Turkey. This vessel, sunk more than 3,000 years ago, carried an astonishing cargo. On its decks were copper ingots from Cyprus, tin from faraway lands, glass, ivory, precious stones, and delicately crafted gold jewelry. It was as though the entire Mediterranean world had placed its treasures onto a single ship. When it sank, it preserved for us a perfect picture of the Bronze Age economy. From this one wreck, we can see how vast, how interconnected, and how fragile this system truly was. Trade, however, was not only about goods. It was also about ideas, about culture, and about diplomacy. Rulers of the Bronze Age understood that they were part of a greater community. We know this from the famous Amarna letters, clay tablets discovered in Egypt, containing correspondence between pharaohs and the kings of neighboring powers. In these letters, kings addressed each other as brother. They exchanged gifts of gold, silver, horses, chariots, and fine garments. They arranged marriages between royal families, binding themselves together with ties of kinship. They also complained, each one insisting that his own gifts were more valuable than those he received in return. These letters reveal not only rivalry, but also respect, a recognition that each great kingdom depended on the others. The Hittites of Anatolia, the Egyptians of the Nile, the Mycenaeans of Greece, the kings of Ugarit and Byblos, all were tied together by this fragile system. A scribe in Ugarit might record a shipment of copper bound for Hattusa. A Mycenaean warrior might carry a sword made from tin mined in Central Asia. A pharaoh in Egypt might adorn his temples with cedar wood from Lebanon. None of these could exist in isolation. Their prosperity depended on one another, on the steady flow of goods across land and sea. This web of trade was also a web of culture. Artistic styles moved from one region to another. Frescoes painted in Crete show influences from Egypt. Myths told in Mesopotamia echo later in the legends of Greece. Writing itself, one of humanity's greatest inventions, passed from one culture to the next, adapted and reshaped. In this melting pot of exchange, the alphabet was born, a system that would one day shape nearly every language in the Western world. Religion, law, music, and even cooking traveled alongside metals and fabrics. To live in the Bronze Age was to live in the first great age of global exchange. Yet for all its brilliance, this system was fragile. If one link in the chain failed, the entire structure shook. If tin did not arrive, bronze could not be made. If grain harvests failed, cities starved. If a kingdom fell, its neighbors felt the shock. This was a world of balance, and balance is always delicate. The very strength of the Bronze Age, its interconnectedness, was also its weakness. Beneath the surface of prosperity, there were always risks. The seas that carried merchants could also carry raiders. The same harbors that welcomed traders could also be filled with invaders. The same ships that carried copper and wine could just as easily carry families fleeing famine, or warriors seeking plunder. Earthquakes could strike without warning, tearing cities apart. Droughts could last for years, bringing hunger and unrest. Kings could fall, and with them, the stability of entire regions. 4 centuries, however, the system endured. The Bronze Age world seemed strong, resilient, and eternal. Palaces rose high above the countryside. Temples glittered with gold. The seas were alive with sails and oars. To the people of that time, it may have seemed that their world could never end. And yet, just beyond the horizon, changes were coming. Storms were gathering. The balance would not hold forever. The Sea Peoples entered history at the very moment when this world of trade began to falter. Their story cannot be separated from the story of the Bronze Age itself, for they were both a product of its connections and a force in its destruction. Were they raiders, seizing the wealth that trade had gathered? Were they migrants, driven onto the sea by famine and war? Or were they simply one more thread in the great unraveling of a system stretched to its limit? These questions remain, but they can only be asked once we understand the brilliance, the fragility, and the beauty of the Bronze Age world. And so, as we continue this journey, let us hold in mind this vision: a ship sailing across the Mediterranean, its hull heavy with copper and tin, its sail full of wind, its crew speaking in many tongues, its cargo representing the lifeblood of empires. That ship is the symbol of the Bronze Age. It is also the symbol of what would soon be lost. For centuries, the world of the Bronze Age had seemed stable, almost eternal. Palaces gleamed with wealth, temples stood tall, and ships moved endlessly across the seas. Yet history teaches us that beneath the calm surface of prosperity, there are always hidden currents. Long before the Great Collapse, subtle signs appeared, warnings written in the language of famine, rebellion, and fear. Tonight, we will move slowly through these shadows, tracing the faint echoes of distress that crept into the records of kings and scribes. One of the first signs came from the skies. Scholars studying ancient pollen, soil layers, and tree rings have found evidence of drought across the eastern Mediterranean around the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. Rainfall became scarce, harvests grew thin, and rivers shrank. For civilizations that depended on steady grain supplies, even a few years of drought could cause unrest. Imagine fields once golden with wheat lying dry and barren, the earth cracked beneath the sun, farmers watching the skies in vain. Without food, kingdoms faltered. Hungry people grew desperate. And desperation spreads quickly. The evidence of famine appears not only in the soil, but also in the letters of ancient rulers. At Ugarit, on the coast of Syria, a desperate message was found among the ruins. It was written on a clay tablet by a king pleading for grain. The enemy is upon us. The harvest has failed. Send help quickly. The letter was never delivered. The city was destroyed before aid could arrive. In another letter, the king of Ugarit wrote to the ruler of Cyprus, begging for shipments of food. His words reveal fear, uncertainty, and the sense that something larger was at work, something beyond his control. At the same time, enemies pressed harder at the borders. Bandits along the caravan routes, pirates along the coasts, rebels within kingdoms, all these forces tested the strength of empires. The letters preserved at Amarna, though written earlier, already reveal complaints of instability. Governors warning of disloyalty, kings accusing their neighbors of betrayal, rulers demanding military aid. The tone of these letters is revealing. Instead of confidence, they carry unease. Instead of triumph, they reveal doubt. The great powers still called each other brother, but the trust between them was weakening. Natural disasters may also have played a role. Archaeological evidence points to a series of earthquakes across the region during this period. Some scholars suggest that entire cities were struck, one after another, weakening defenses and leaving populations vulnerable. Imagine a palace collapsing in the middle of the night, its walls reduced to rubble, its storage jars smashed, its people suddenly homeless. An earthquake does not need to destroy an empire outright. It needs only to strike at the wrong moment, compounding famine, rebellion, and invasion. In a fragile system, even one disaster can create waves that spread across kingdoms. The Hittite Empire, which had once rivaled Egypt, began to show cracks. Its armies were stretched thin, fighting wars on multiple fronts. Its capital, Hattusa, became vulnerable. To the south, cities in Canaan felt pressure from both internal unrest and foreign attack. Mycenaean Greece, known for its warriors and palaces, also faced decline. Linear B tablets from Pylos record hurried preparations for defense, as though enemies were already at the gates. The sense of urgency is unmistakable. Something was coming. Perhaps the most haunting evidence comes again from Ugarit, the coastal city that had thrived as a hub of trade. In its ruins, archaeologists discovered letters written in haste, warnings of invasion, pleas for assistance. One message from a high official to the king reads, "The enemy ships are already here. They are doing much damage in the land. If no assistance comes, we will fall." These words, frozen in clay, may be among the last written before Ugarit was destroyed. The city was burned, its people scattered, its voice silenced forever. Who were these enemies? Some may have been traditional rivals, raiders, pirates, local rebels. But increasingly, inscriptions point to strangers, outsiders, people from the sea. Egyptian records mention foreign groups pressing against their borders, arriving not only as warriors but with families, carts, and livestock. This was not a raid, it was a movement of peoples. It is here that the shadow of the sea peoples first appears, faint at first, then growing stronger with each passing year. We must be cautious, however. History rarely gives us a single cause. Famine, earthquakes, rebellion, invasion, all combined to weaken the web of the Bronze Age. What mattered most was that these crises struck simultaneously, across multiple kingdoms. Each empire, strong on its own, became vulnerable when its neighbors faltered. When Ugarit fell, its trade ceased. When the Hittites weakened, their allies lost protection. When Mycenaean Greece burned, the flow of goods was interrupted. The web began to unravel, one thread at a time. And so, by the late 13th century BCE, the world that had once seemed unshakable began to tremble. Palaces fortified their walls. Kings sent urgent letters. Farmers struggled to feed their families. Traders found the seas more dangerous than before. The prosperity of centuries began to fade into uncertainty. The stage was being set for something greater, for the arrival of the sea peoples, whose movements would shake the entire region. As you listen, imagine standing in a palace as the warning comes. Enemy ships on the horizon, smoke rising in the distance, messengers breathless with fear. The storerooms are full, but for how long? The guards are ready, but against whom? In that moment, the silence of history deepens. We know what comes next. The collapse is approaching. The storm is almost here. The Late Bronze Age was a world bound together by trade, diplomacy, and shared culture, yet by the early 12th century BCE, the foundations of that world began to crack. While Egypt faced the first major encounters with the Sea Peoples, other regions were already trembling under pressures both internal and external. Cities burned, palaces fell, trade routes froze, and entire empires disappeared from history. The story of this widespread destruction is slow, terrifying, and yet strangely mesmerizing, like watching the gradual retreat of a tide before a storm. In Greece, the palaces of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, once symbols of wealth and power, were abandoned or destroyed. Archaeological evidence shows layers of fire and debris, revealing a sudden and violent end. The Linear B tablets, once carefully recording trade and taxation, were left unfinished, scattered across palace floors. These palaces had depended on the flow of goods from Crete, Anatolia, and the Levant. Timber, metals, grain, and luxury items. When trade slowed, and attacks threatened the countryside, the palaces could no longer sustain themselves. Some scholars suggest that these destructions were the result of internal revolt, while others point to invasions by unknown peoples. Perhaps it was both. The end of Mycenae was not a single event but a process, unfolding over decades, leaving behind ruins that would lie silent for centuries. Ugarit, the coastal city on the Syrian shore, tells a similarly tragic story. Once a thriving center of trade, it was the meeting point of ships carrying goods from Cyprus, Crete, and Egypt. Its scribes wrote letters that reveal a vibrant society in communication with kingdoms far and wide. Yet the final letters, discovered on clay tablets preserved in the ruins, speak of fear and desperation. They describe enemy fleets on the horizon, pleas for reinforcements, and warnings that were never answered. Archaeology confirms that Ugarit was burned to the ground, its population scattered, and its rich libraries and archives lost forever. This city, which had served as a hub of civilization, disappeared almost entirely, leaving only traces of its existence for modern scholars to reconstruct. Meanwhile, to the north, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia faced its own collapse. Hattusa, the capital, was abandoned. Evidence of widespread destruction, burnt palaces, collapsed fortifications, and disrupted settlements, suggests that attacks, internal revolt, and possibly natural disasters combined to bring down one of the most powerful empires of the age. The Hittites had been regional rivals of Egypt and had ruled a vast territory stretching across Anatolia and northern Syria. Yet their mighty empire could not withstand the combined pressures of famine, rebellion, and the movement of peoples along the coastlines and river valleys. By the time of Ramses III, the Hittite Empire had already vanished, leaving a vacuum that would never be fully filled. Throughout the Levant, similar patterns emerge. Cities in modern-day Lebanon, Israel, and Syria show destruction layers dating to this period. Archaeologists find evidence of fire, abandoned fortifications, and new settlements appearing immediately afterward. Some of these new sites reveal cultural elements tied to the Sea Peoples, suggesting that while old cities fell, new populations moved in, adapted, and survived. In other words, the Sea Peoples may not have destroyed everything indiscriminately. They often settled where they attacked, creating new communities and blending with the local populations. This pattern is particularly evident in the emergence of the Philistines along the southern Levantine coast. It is important to remember that the collapse was not uniform. Some regions survived better than others. Egypt, though challenged by repeated attacks, managed to defend its core territories. Its central government held strong, and the Nile's life-giving waters provided resilience against famine. In contrast, regions like Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant experienced near-total societal collapse in certain areas. The difference lay in geography, resources, and central authority. Areas that could rely on natural defenses or continuous food supplies had a higher chance of survival, while interconnected trading cities, dependent on distant resources, were highly vulnerable. The causes of this collapse were multifaceted. Climate studies indicate that prolonged droughts may have struck the eastern Mediterranean around the same time, severely limiting agricultural production. Earthquakes, common in this tectonically active region, would have compounded the problem, destroying already strained cities. Famine and disease likely spread as populations moved or became trapped in declining urban centers. Political instability, combined with social unrest, created a perfect environment for invasions or migrations. Into this world stepped the Sea Peoples, whose movements were both a symptom and a catalyst of the larger collapse. It is tempting to imagine a single dramatic invasion sweeping across the region. But the evidence suggests a more complex reality. The Sea Peoples may have attacked some areas directly, forced migration in others, and merely passed through still other regions. Their arrival coincided with the weakening of local powers, making it easier for them to displace or integrate into populations already under stress. They were part of a domino effect in which economic, environmental, and political pressures interacted in unpredictable ways. Their presence did not create the collapse alone, but it accelerated it, reshaping the map of the eastern Mediterranean. By the end of this period, the map of the Bronze Age world looked unrecognizable. Cities that had flourished for centuries were reduced to rubble. Palaces and temples were left abandoned. Trade networks that once spanned thousands of miles were broken. Populations moved, disappeared, or were assimilated into new cultural identities. And yet, from these ruins, new societies would eventually emerge, carrying forward fragments of the old world, blending them with new influences. The Philistines, the Phoenicians, and later Greek civilizations would all arise from the ashes of the Bronze Age. The Sea Peoples, mysterious and largely anonymous, had left an indelible mark on history. In reflecting on this widespread destruction, one cannot help but notice the scale and simultaneity of these events. The collapse was not limited to a single city, empire, or kingdom. It was a regional phenomenon, affecting Greece, Anatolia, Syria, Canaan, and parts of Cyprus. The interconnected nature of Bronze Age trade, once a source of strength, became a channel for rapid disruption. The very systems that had made civilizations prosperous, communication, trade, and alliances, also made them vulnerable. One city falls, and the ripple spreads. One trade route blocked, and multiple regions feel the strain. This was a collapse of a network as much as of individual powers. As you listen, imagine walking through the ruins of these cities. Imagine the charred walls of Mycenae, the empty streets of Ugarit, the abandoned palaces of Hattusa. Hear the silence where once there was music, commerce, and conversation. See the artifacts left behind, broken pottery, shattered tools, scattered weapons, and imagine the lives that these objects once supported. Every ruin tells a story, not just of destruction, but also of survival, adaptation, and change. Amidst the sweeping destruction of the Late Bronze Age, Egypt stood as one of the few civilizations to resist total collapse. The Nile Valley, nourished by the river's steady floods, provided a lifeline of food, water, and stability that many other regions lacked. Yet even here, the shadow of the Sea Peoples loomed large. By the time Ramses III ascended the throne in the early 12th century BCE, Egypt faced a threat unlike any it had confronted in generations. This was not a localized rebellion, a simple raid, or even a single army. It was a coordinated, multi-pronged invasion of the Nile Delta, accompanied by seafaring warriors and foreign contingents seeking new lands. Ramses III's inscriptions, carved in relief at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, provide the most vivid depiction of these events. They portray a pharaoh determined to protect Egypt at all costs. In the reliefs, massive enemy fleets appear on the horizon, their oars cutting through the water, shields glinting in the sunlight, warriors ready for battle. The Egyptians prepared carefully, deploying their soldiers along the coast, constructing defensive barriers, and fortifying strategic points. When the first wave of invaders arrived, the Egyptians met them with a combination of naval and land tactics, engaging in fierce battles that lasted for days. The text accompanying the reliefs emphasizes both the scale of the threat and the pharaoh's heroism. Ramses III claims that the Sea Peoples were annihilated in the river mouths of the delta, their ships destroyed, their warriors slain or drowned. He boasts of the security of Egypt, presenting himself as the savior of his people. Yet even in these triumphal inscriptions, historians discern subtle hints of exhaustion. The campaigns required immense resources, the army had to be mobilized across multiple fronts, and the economy strained to support the war effort. Victory came at a cost, and Egypt, though spared, would never again wield the uncontested power it had enjoyed under Ramses II. While Ramses III repelled the Sea Peoples from Egypt itself, the effects of their movements were felt far beyond the Nile. The Bronze Age world was already fracturing. In Canaan, settlements were disrupted, some destroyed outright, others abandoned. The Mycenaean Greek palaces had already fallen, and Cyprus experienced both internal unrest and foreign pressure. Egypt's ability to resist collapse was due in part to its geographic advantages: the Nile as a source of sustenance and transportation, natural deserts shielding its borders, and a strong centralized government capable of mobilizing armies and resources effectively. Yet even Egypt could not restore the vast networks of trade that had connected the Mediterranean for centuries. The aftermath of Ramses III's campaigns reveals both the success and limitations of Egypt's defense. The Nile Delta was secured, the Sea Peoples repelled, and Egypt survived when neighboring kingdoms perished. However, the economic and social consequences were significant. Trade networks were permanently altered. Goods that had once flowed from Cyprus, Crete, Anatolia, and the Levant were disrupted. Egypt's cities, while intact, faced the challenge of feeding a population dependent on a diminished Mediterranean economy. The central government maintained authority, but local provinces experienced strain, sometimes leading to minor rebellions and internal instability. Interestingly, the reliefs at Medinet Habu also show the fate of captured sea peoples. They are depicted as prisoners, their distinctive helmets, weapons, and attire recorded in meticulous detail. Some were settled within Egypt as laborers or auxiliaries, integrated into the society they had sought to conquer. This practice of resettlement reveals an Egyptian strategy not only of defense but also of adaptation. By incorporating the defeated into their own economy and society, Egypt mitigated future threats and preserved a labor force vital for agriculture, construction, and military service. These campaigns highlight a broader pattern in history. Survival is often as much about adaptation as it is about victory. While other Bronze Age civilizations crumbled under the combined pressures of famine, rebellion, and invasion, Egypt's centralized administration, resource management, and geographic advantages allowed it to endure. Yet the survival came at a price. The pharaohs could no longer rely on distant trade networks for luxury goods. Military campaigns drained resources, and while Egypt remained a power, it was a power diminished and cautious, no longer capable of projecting influence across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The story of Ramses III also provides insight into the psychology of the time. The reliefs and inscriptions were intended not only as historical records but as propaganda, reinforcing the pharaoh's divine authority. Ramses is shown as a godlike figure, standing tall above the chaos, slaying enemies with his own hands, directing the army with wisdom and courage. This message served a dual purpose. It reassured the Egyptian population that their leader was strong, and it communicated to potential aggressors that Egypt remained formidable, even in a time of regional upheaval. Yet beyond propaganda, the archaeological record hints at subtle social changes. Some scholars suggest that the presence of sea peoples within Egypt may have introduced new cultural elements, artistic motifs, military technologies, and even minor demographic shifts. These influences, though secondary to Egypt's survival, illustrate how migration and conflict can leave traces beyond immediate destruction, shaping societies in ways that unfold over generations. In reflecting on Egypt's experience, one is struck by the contrast with the surrounding regions. While Mycenaean Greece, Hutti, and Ugarit were reduced to rubble, Egypt endured. Geography, centralization, and adaptive strategies allowed the Nile civilization to persist. But the Bronze Age world had changed irreversibly. Trade routes were broken. Cities were destroyed. The era of great palaces, widespread international diplomacy, and interconnected Mediterranean networks had ended. Egypt's survival was remarkable, but it was a survival in a transformed world, a world that would never return to the prosperity of the previous centuries. The legacy of these events is profound. Ramses III's campaigns delayed the spread of chaos, preserved one of humanity's great civilizations, and allowed a measure of continuity in an age otherwise defined by collapse. At the same time, the encounters with the Sea Peoples exemplify the vulnerability of even the mightiest empires. They serve as a reminder that environmental pressures, mass migrations, and coordinated invasions can challenge the strongest powers, and that resilience often requires both military might and societal adaptability. As we imagine the Nile Delta during this period, we see ships lining the coast, Egyptian warriors readying defenses, and the Sea People's fleet approaching with determination. The battle is fierce, the stakes monumental. And though Ramses III emerges victorious, the larger narrative of collapse continues. Egypt survived, but the interconnected world around it had been forever altered. The stage was now set for the rise of new peoples, new cultures, and new political structures in the post-Bronze Age Mediterranean. The collapse of the Bronze Age was not merely an end, it was also a beginning. As empires fell, cities burned, and trade networks disintegrated, new peoples moved into the vacuums left behind. Among them were the enigmatic Sea Peoples, whose presence had been first recorded in Egyptian inscriptions. They did not vanish after their confrontations with Ramses III. Instead, many settled along the coasts of the southern Levant, in what would later be known as Philistia. Their migration marked a significant demographic and cultural shift in the region, leaving traces that archaeologists and historians can still observe today. The Philistines are perhaps the most well-known descendants of these movements. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath reveals distinctive material culture. Pottery styles reminiscent of Aegean Greece, architectural forms with Mycenaean influences, and burial practices unlike those of the surrounding Canaanite populations. These artifacts suggest that while the Philistines adopted some local traditions, they also retained elements of their original identity. In this sense, the Sea Peoples were not simply conquerors, they were migrants adapting to new lands, blending old customs with new environments. The arrival of these new populations had far-reaching consequences. Cities previously under Egyptian or Hittite influence now experienced shifts in governance, economic activity, and social organization. Former trade hubs like Ugarit had already been destroyed, leaving the eastern Mediterranean fragmented. Into this patchwork stepped new powers, smaller kingdoms, and city-states, many influenced by these incoming groups. The old centralized empires were gone, replaced by a more localized, decentralized political landscape. This transformation would define the Iron Age and the geopolitical contours of the region for centuries. Cultural influence also spread through art, technology, and religious practices. Philistine pottery demonstrates a continuation of Aegean artistic traditions, often adapted to local materials and tastes. The design of their homes, with orthogonal layouts and stone foundations, reflects architectural concepts from the Greek mainland. Even their weapons, including certain types of swords and shields, show Aegean influence. These tangible elements illustrate how displaced peoples can carry cultural memories into new lands, reshaping societies around them without erasing the existing inhabitants. The Sea Peoples' settlement also influenced linguistic development. While they eventually adopted local languages, early inscriptions suggest a mix of tongues in the southern Levant, reflecting a period of cultural intermingling. Over generations, these languages merged, contributing to the evolution of regional dialects and, eventually, to the linguistic foundations of the Iron Age Mediterranean. In this way, the movement of the Sea Peoples helped catalyze the next stage of cultural development, even as the Bronze Age networks of diplomacy and trade lay in ruins. Meanwhile, surviving civilizations, such as Egypt, adapted to the new realities. The central government continued to control the Nile Valley, but trade routes were reoriented, military strategies revised, and urban planning adjusted to new threats. Egypt's economy became more self-reliant, focusing on domestic production and local security rather than international exchange. While the glory of the previous era faded, the lessons of resilience, adaptation, and centralized authority ensured the continuation of Egyptian civilization into the Iron Age. Elsewhere, the collapse led to smaller kingdoms rising from the ashes of fallen empires. In Greece, new settlements appeared where the Mycenaean palaces had once stood, often with less hierarchical organization and a stronger focus on local communities. In Anatolia, the collapse of the Hittite Empire led to the emergence of independent city-states and minor kingdoms, which would later interact with Assyrian and Phrygian powers. These shifts demonstrate how the vacuum left by one civilization often allows multiple smaller groups to flourish, creating a more diverse political and cultural landscape. Trade, once the lifeblood of the Bronze Age, continued but on a smaller scale. Merchants adapted to the new geopolitical realities, favoring local and regional networks over long-distance exchanges. Cyprus, the Levant, and Egypt maintained some level of commercial activity, particularly in metalwork and pottery, but the vast Mediterranean trade networks of the previous centuries were gone. The interruption of these connections marked the end of a pan-Mediterranean Bronze Age world and the beginning of a more fragmented, regionalized Iron Age economy. Religious practices also evolved. The destruction of temples and the decline of centralized authority disrupted traditional cults. New gods, rituals, and syncretic practices emerged as peoples migrated and mingled. Archaeologists note changes in temple construction, offerings, and iconography, reflecting both continuity and adaptation. The fusion of Aegean, Canaanite, and Egyptian influences created a diverse religious landscape, demonstrating that even in periods of collapse, cultural exchange and evolution continue. In summary, the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse was not only a period of destruction but also a period of transformation. The Sea Peoples, far from disappearing, became agents of change, settling in new territories, influencing local populations, and contributing to the rise of the Philistines. Surviving civilizations adapted, reorganized, and laid the foundations for future societies. The Eastern Mediterranean emerged from the chaos as a world both familiar and profoundly altered, a place where the old and the new coexisted, setting the stage for the Iron Age. As you imagine this scene, picture the southern Levant after the collapse. Newly settled coastal towns, Aegean-style pottery stacked in storerooms, homes rebuilt with stone and timber, markets alive with the hum of conversation in multiple languages, and families adapting to a new world. The Sea Peoples, once feared invaders, now plant roots in the lands they had traversed, shaping the cultural and demographic landscape for generations to come. This transformation is a testament to human resilience, migration, and the enduring power of cultural adaptation. The Bronze Age ended, yes, but its echoes continued in these new societies. The story of collapse is intertwined with the story of survival. The Sea Peoples, the Philistines, the local populations, and surviving kingdoms all contributed to a complex tapestry of change. From destruction arose innovation, adaptation, and the seeds of a new era, a world ready to enter the Iron Age, carrying with it the memory of the once interconnected Bronze Age Mediterranean. The Sea Peoples is, in many ways, the story of history itself, a mixture of clarity and uncertainty, fact and interpretation, triumph and tragedy. Even after centuries of study, we still do not know who exactly the Sea Peoples were, where they originated, or what ultimately became of all their constituent groups. What we do know is that they arrived at a moment when the Eastern Mediterranean world was already fragile, a world built on complex trade networks, delicate alliances, and a careful balance of resources. Their movements both reflected and accelerated the profound transformations of the Late Bronze Age. The inscriptions left by the Egyptians, particularly those of Ramses III, offer the most vivid contemporary accounts. They depict a seemingly invincible pharaoh facing waves of invaders from the sea, battling with courage and strategy to protect his people. Yet, as historians read between the lines, we see a more nuanced reality. The Sea Peoples were not a monolithic force but a collection of disparate groups, some fleeing famine or political collapse, some seeking new lands, some drawn by opportunity or desperation. They were human beings responding to immense pressures, moving across the Mediterranean in search of survival. Across the Eastern Mediterranean, their influence can be seen in the archaeological record. Destruction layers in Mycenae and Ugarit, the abandonment of Hittite cities, and the emergence of new settlements in the Levant. Yet the Sea Peoples were not solely agents of destruction. Many settled in the lands they reached, integrating with local populations, adopting new practices, and leaving lasting cultural legacies. The Philistines, in particular, illustrate this process. Their pottery, architecture, weaponry, and burial customs reveal a synthesis of Aegean, Canaanite, and Egyptian influences. In this way, the Sea Peoples were both destroyers and creators, catalysts for a new era in human history. The collapse itself offers broader lessons about the fragility and resilience of civilizations. The interconnectedness that allowed trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange to flourish also created vulnerability. When environmental stress, internal unrest, and external pressure coincided, the result was a cascade of failures. Yet, even in the face of collapse, human societies adapted. Some perished entirely, leaving only ruins and stories. Others, like Egypt, survived by leveraging geographic advantages, central authority, and strategic adaptability. Still others, like the Sea Peoples themselves, moved, settled, and helped shape the post-collapse world. From a modern perspective, the Bronze Age collapse illustrates the complexity of historical causation. It was not the work of a single invader, nor the result of one failed harvest, nor solely the effect of natural disasters. Instead, it was the interplay of multiple factors: climate stress, earthquakes, famine, rebellion, social upheaval, trade disruption, and mass migrations. The Sea Peoples were a visible manifestation of these processes, a tangible symbol of the forces reshaping the world. Yet they were neither omnipotent nor entirely destructive. They were part of a larger human story, one that reminds us that history is never linear, predictable, or simple. The mystery of the Sea Peoples also captures our imagination because it touches on questions that remain unresolved. Where exactly did these peoples come from? What drove their movements? How did they organize themselves for such coordinated campaigns? Scholars continue to debate these questions, drawing on linguistic evidence, archaeology, and comparative history. Some theories suggest that environmental collapse in the Aegean, including drought or volcanic activity, prompted migrations. Others point to political unrest in Anatolia, Crete, or Cyprus. Still others emphasize the role of opportunistic raiding in a world already destabilized by famine and societal stress. Perhaps the truth encompasses all these factors, a convergence of pressure, chance, and human agency. Despite the uncertainties, the story of the Sea Peoples has a clear significance. They mark the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, a period in which new political entities emerged, trade networks were reorganized, and cultures blended in unprecedented ways. They highlight the mobility of human populations, the adaptability of societies under stress, and the capacity for migration to reshape regional histories. They remind us that collapse is rarely total and that human ingenuity, resilience, and adaptation persist even amid widespread turmoil. The legacy of the Bronze Age collapse, and of the Sea Peoples within it, resonates across time. Archaeologists, historians, and linguists continue to uncover fragments of this story. Pottery shards, burned palaces, letters on clay tablets, and reliefs carved into temple walls. These remnants allow us to reconstruct a world both distant and familiar, one in which the rhythms of trade, diplomacy, war, and migration shaped the lives of countless individuals. Each artifact, each inscription, is a whisper from the past, telling us that even the most powerful civilizations are vulnerable, yet capable of remarkable endurance. As we conclude our exploration, we might imagine standing on the shores of the eastern Mediterranean over 3,000 years ago. Ships approach the coast, carrying people whose identities and origins remain partly unknown. Cities once bustling with commerce and culture lie abandoned or smoldering in the distance. Survivors rebuild, migrants settle, and a new era slowly takes shape. This is the world of the Sea Peoples, a world of mystery, challenge, and transformation. It is a world that reminds us of the fragility of empires, the mobility of peoples, and the enduring impact of human resilience. Ultimately, the Sea Peoples remain a symbol of both uncertainty and continuity. They are a reminder that history is shaped not only by great leaders and empires but also by the movements, struggles, and adaptations of ordinary people. The collapse of the Bronze Age was not the end of civilization. It was a transition, a reshaping of the human landscape that paved the way for the societies, cultures, and networks that would define the Iron Age. In this light, the Sea Peoples are not merely invaders from a forgotten past. They are witnesses to one of the most profound transformations in human history. As the night settles and the ancient Mediterranean quiets, we can imagine the echoes of this era lingering in the ruins, the inscriptions, and the artifacts left behind. The Sea Peoples vanish from the record, yet their impact endures, etched into the story of the civilizations that survived and into the imagination of those who study them today. Their mystery endures, and in that mystery lies the fascination, the lessons, and the enduring legacy of the Bronze Age collective.